Author is funded by the Pacific Northwest Writers Association, supporting writers from pen to publication since 1955. To learn more about the PNWA and their yearly conference, please go to pnwa.org. Hi, this is Bill Kenower of Author Magazine, and I'm here at Elliott Bay Book Company in Seattle, Washington with Meghan O'Rourke, author of The Long Goodbye. Welcome to Author.
Thanks so much for having me.
I read an interview you said writing is the way in which you understand the world, that you use to understand, to someone who doesn't understand the world that way. Tell us what you mean. How does one do that?
You know, there's a metaphor in The Long Goodbye. A friend of mine talked about how our consciousness is like the boat on top of an ocean, and really so much of our experience is actually that ocean, right? It's not. And it seems to me that there's so much that we know that we sometimes cut off. There's so much going on around us, and there's so much stimulation that we don't maybe even pause to know that we know it, or we don't want to know what we know, or whatever it might be, right? And certainly in the case of watching my mother suffer from illness, and I've talked to a lot of people who feel this, there's so much going on and there's so much stimulation, and especially the last weeks of an illness feel so fast that for me, writing things down really became a way of kind of trying to create some calm and some stillness in the middle of that storm. And I find that when I'm writing things down, it slows my brain down, and it gives me that time and almost that kind of space to really sit with something that's kind of vibrating oddly, a little, maybe a comment someone made, you know, that kind of thing. But it can be more metaphysical, you know, and I think this is the part of me that writes poetry. It could be just wanting to translate something that's beautiful in the world into language that seems beautiful to me. And there's something, for me, I think very satisfying about that experience, and it seems as real, that act of trying to translate, seems as real as anything else to me.
I'm so glad you used that word. That's the one I write about writing often, and that's the word I always use, that writing is an act of translation from within you to something without you.
Yeah.
It's because it all begins formless inside of you, doesn't it?
Yes.
Everything.
Yes.
It has no shape.
Formless is such a crucial word.
Yes.
And whenever I'm teaching poetry, I insist on talking about this with my students, because they think that a poem is just kind of a translation, or not even a translation, it's a kind of, spurting out of thoughts and feelings, and the more they're felt, the better the poem. And I say, no, it's all about the form, finding the form that the poem wants, finding the form that the experience wants in writing, because you could feel everything in the world and it could be bad writing. Sadly.
So, Long Goodbye is about the period of time, your mother's death, and then your learning the experience of grief following that. So, my first question is, why publish this? It's very personal, it just happened. Why publish it? Why share this?
When my mother died, I was really behind on a column that I was writing for Slate. And my editor said to me, well, what are you thinking about? What is there something else you might want to write about? And I said, well, nothing I want to write about, but I'm just obsessed with grief, and not just my own, but how one experiences it. So she said, well, I think you should write about this. And I said, oh, please. My mother dying, it's very sad to me, but it's the way of nature, and it's the most ordinary story in the world.
Yeah, it's like no one's ever written about their mother dying before.
But I just thought, this is, who cares? Who cares, right? It's so ordinary. What claim does this story have? And she said, no, I think that's why you should write about it, that it is this kind of experience that's so universal, and that, as you say, nonetheless feels really isolating, and how that's interesting. So she kind of encouraged me to write the first column. And I will tell you, I really thought, I am just exposing these feelings, they're very unfiltered. But I did it. And the piece went up, I think on my birthday, actually, a month after my mom died. And I felt, oh my God, what have I done? And I will tell you that within 3 hours, I think I had something like 300 emails from readers. And I had written about many topics that were kind of hot button topics. I had never gotten a response like this before. And they were all from people, not everyone agreed with what I was saying, which was about this kind of sense of there being a taboo around the intensity of grief, and also just an isolation. But a lot of people did, and even those who didn't agree said there's something going on here. And what you're describing, so much of what you're describing is something that I felt, even though my story is really different. So that was the thing, right? That those people emboldened me to keep writing, and I wrote a few more columns for Slate and kept getting this kind of response, and I thought something is happening here. Though I will say I also wanted it, I came across this Iris Murdoch quote, the bereaved cannot communicate with the unbereaved.
Do you believe that?
Yeah, I do.
Okay.
And I wanted the book to be an active communication, and a kind of, on the one hand, a love letter to my mother and a kind of elegy from my mother, but on the other hand, a letter to my friends to say, this is what I couldn't say, this is what you wanted to help me with,
Right.
and where we couldn't quite meet.
As I've matured, I've come to feel with absolute certainty that to understand where the joy of life lies, it relies upon your relationship to death, to your understanding of it. There's a great scene in the book where you overhear, is it Liam?
My brother Liam.
Yeah.
And it was asking his mother if she's going to die, if he's going to die, what she thinks is going to happen. And it was a question that haunted me, and that in my kind of shy, introverted way, it was the question I couldn't speak. And
Right.
You'll never forget that moment of hearing him utter that. It was really extraordinary. I agree with you. I mean, I think that there's a beautiful quote from Marilynne Robinson, who's one of my favorite novelists, where she talks, and she has an explicitly religious perspective, but it's a moral perspective too, an ethical perspective. And she says that suffering is part of the human privilege. And this is part of what I was trying to get at in a hopefully not grim way in the book,
Right.
which is that it is so painful and so terrible to go through a loss. But ideally, it deepens us and connects us to others. And I think
Yes.
there's something a little bit off in the way where our culture is handling this. It's kind of like, the presence of corn everywhere in our food diet. You know what I mean? I think I talk about this in the book. I remembered really early after my mother died getting on the subway, and someone had been like really rude to me and shoved me, and I was just like, how can you do? I wish I were wearing black, like widow's weeds. And I remember standing there and looking around and thinking, you know what? How many other people in this car are feeling the way I feel right now? Probably so many, probably a lot, or recently felt this way, right? And it kind of, and for a while, and I still try to think this, anytime someone's, rude to me, or I try to think, maybe something's going on with them that I don't know about.
Well, that great quote, I think it's Plato, be kind,
Yeah.
everyone is engaged in a great struggle.
Yeah.
The memoirist always begins knowing what she wants to see. She knows the story because she's lived it, she knows it somewhat.
Right.
But then there's the writing of it. So there's what you know when you sit down for the first time to begin your story, and then there's what you know once you're done writing it. Mm-hmm. What did you learn writing it that in a way you didn't know before? If anything, maybe you didn't learn anything in that way.
What's funny about this book is I didn't know what the book was, because the book was partly about, as I said, the lived experience of loss.
And you were to some degree writing it as you
I was writing it as I
Okay,
went.
it was.
So what I knew at the end, to answer your second question, was the book really mimics the journey of the first 2 years of mourning, 2.5 years of mourning. And what I knew at the end was that this was something that was going to be with me my whole life, that a loss is not the sadness you feel of the first separation, but like a tree that now has an obstacle in its way, it had shaped the entire subsequent growth. Not necessarily for ill only. And so I had come to that place of thinking, I've survived the toughest part of this, and I have found that I could turn that into art, hopefully, and that was, for me, the through line, the continuity, because when you suffer a loss, your whole sense of identity can really kind of, that person who is such a big part of your life isn't there, so then what do you do with that part of you that was connected to them? And I think one of the answers is you find the thing that can't be taken away from you. And so I think that was part of it, was that writing was always going to be there, and that writing was going to be hopefully the through line of my life as it goes toward its end.
Yes.